All right. How is everybody? Is this on? Sounds like it. So it must be a miracle because I'm actually here on time 2 weeks in a row. Praise the Lord. So I know that's sort of out of character, but we're just gonna get started. Um, Also, disclaimer, if my phone rings, I'm sorry. I do have a research student in my lab right now. So if he's dying, he's supposed to call me. So that might happen. Um, so like the format of this is pretty, we want to keep it casual and informal. Uh, we kind of have the first sort of presentation bit, but that doesn't mean that you can't necessarily ask a question during then. Last week, I think Jay fielded the mic, but I don't know if we're doing that or not. If you have a question during or at the end, we'll somehow take your question and I might have to repeat it or something. But um, please do have questions because I think that's what makes this kind of more interesting, discussion and interactions. And the this is the plan, sort of the for the 6 weeks. But I when we do this sort of on campus with students, usually there's so many like subtopic requests. Some of the requested topics are so interesting and maybe controversial. I don't know if I want to mention it on YouTube, but people, students come up with really interesting things to talk about, ask about, and then there's usually a ton of those. So that's why, like, I wanted to kind of dedicate the 6 weeks just to the topics or anything you guys suggest, or like things, or even subtopics that we didn't get to cover during those first 5 weeks. Please send them to me by email. You might say, well, dude, I talked to you about it or asked you, but you know how it is. Please don't take it personal. I won't remember. So if you could just email me those things, then I actually will remember and probably will address those things. So anyway, well, Father, we thank you for this gathering. And then I pray once again for this discussion time to be edifying to all of us and somehow be glorifying to you. And to that end, would you please be with us here now in your spirit in Jesus' name. Amen. So let's see. So today we want to talk about sort of the origin of life type of issues and maybe a little bit more of intelligent design type of stuff. We'll try to touch on that. And then the next week, I guess it's kind of a busy week. We'll try to address some of the age of Earth type of concerns, as well as directly hitting issues that have directly to do with human evolution, so-called. And to me, the most interesting week is all the scientific evidence and scriptural teaching about Noah's flood and what the original world may have looked like, which was very different. That to me is like really interesting. And then, who wouldn't like dinosaurs? So that's the plan. And I think we showed this slide just as a recap. These are the two different worldviews that people would have depending on where you're coming from. And I mentioned that, like, while I'm a creationist, which, by the way, I didn't share this with you last week, but for those of you who've never heard sort of how I became a Christian, in college, my aspiration was to be somebody like Richard Dawkins. I don't know if you know who that is, but he's like the poster child of modern atheism movement. And then I thought by going to college, I could become somebody like him. That was my aspiration. And I thought that, and then like I had some friends who would try to witness to me at work and whatnot on campus. And they would talk to me about the Bible and creationism and the gospel and whatnot. That was the first time I heard most of that ever in my life. course, that really irritated me as because I was a good atheist. So I thought I would try to basically tell them exactly why they were wrong. And so I went on a journey to sort of research all that topics, and I sort of became a quasi-creationist as a result. But I wasn't ready to like jump into religion, so I was kind of an agnostic spiritually for a while until uh, one of those there was a group of Christians who were trying to witness to me, and then they at one point, I don't know why they thought it would be a good idea, but they lied to me and said they were going to take me snowboarding. But in reality, they dropped me off at a mega church in Southern Oregon for a Christmas Eve service. I don't think that tactic is quite scriptural, but anyway, it maybe kind of worked because I was so mad. I didn't even go inside the building. I was just outside, literally and metaphorically smoking, and then and I didn't go inside. But during the service, some guy walked out of the service and sheepishly handed me one of those New Testament only Bibles, and he said something like, "God told me to give you this," and I gave him some four-letter words and whatnot that I won't repeat, but I kept that Bible, and like a few weeks later, when I didn't have anything to do on a weekend, I just decided to read through, of all things, the book of Romans, and that's sort of what did it, long story short. And I just apologized to God for the hardness of heart I had towards him and his people, because you would not believe how militant and mean I used to be towards Christians, because I was trying to on a mission to convert them to atheism. Anyway, I also shared last week that there's while I'm a creationist Christian, and there's some Christians who might share more of an evolutionistic worldview, mainly because I don't think that the gospel has to necessarily hinge on that. We'll touch on some of that issue when we talk about human evolution a little bit. But also, at the end of the day, at least for me, the confidence I have in sort of the Christian faith doesn't necessarily come from everything that we're talking about per se, because I personally know Jesus Christ. And so, if like tomorrow there's like a huge set of evidence for a worldview that's not quite mine, that really won't necessarily shake up the foundation of my faith anyway. But I hope that all these talks and discussions will be interesting and maybe edifying to you. And I think we talked about some people have a slightly different versions of creationist worldview. It may be good, might as well that I shared a little bit of my testimony, because when those Christian friends were witnessing to me when I was an atheist, one of the main things that really shook my atheist belief is this first thing I want to talk to you about. And that has to do with supposedly how according to the evolutionist worldview, where the Big Bang happened and all this matter came into existence from nothing, and then like 4.5 billion years ago, all this really hot material came together, and so it was really hot, and then it rained on that molten rock for many millions of years, and eventually that somehow caused all these like complicated chemical reactions that led to the first life, 3 billion years ago or something like that, is the sort of the typical evolutionistic worldview of the history. So back supposedly when the Earth was a molten rock of a mess that it was, that's when the first thing, according to that narrative, one of the first things that like cooled and solidified was the granite rock layer. And at that part actually kind of makes sense, because at least the granite rock layer is usually at the bottom of all the sedimentation layers in the Earth's crust. So even biblical creationists like myself would say, yeah, the bottom of the Earth's crust is the granite rock layer. That's kind of something that nobody disputes. Um, but evolutionists would say those things crystallized from magma like many years ago. Now, today, if you go look at granite rock under a microscope, you could do this if you have a granite rock kitchen counter, but not with those fake ones glue on the wood. But if you have the real stuff, then if you look at that under microscope, you might actually see microscopic patterns like this, like a perfect circles. And the reason why you might see that is because of actually a radioactive decay of some elements. And you guys probably know like uranium is used for like nuclear power, nuclear weapons, right? But there's other elements or isotopes that are also radioactive and they can decay. And when they decay, they obviously emit like radiation, but that could come in a couple of different ways, different formats, flavors. One of those is called alpha decay or alpha ray that it emits. And polonium-218 is one such isotope, this element called polonium, and its weight happens to be 218. And it spits out this thing called alpha particle. Now that is special because it's kind of a big particle, and because it's a big particle, it leaves behind these scar tissues in the rock itself. Does that make sense? And you can measure how big that circle of scar tissue, that's what you're looking at in the picture there, the yellow-orange thing. By measuring that diameter, you can determine how much energy that alpha particle must have had when that radioactive element decayed. Does that kind of make sense? And based on that amount of energy that you can calculate just from the diameter of that circle that it leaves behind, you can predict or you can determine what exact isotope or what exact element or atom was responsible for decaying and leaving all that halo-like scar tissue, which is those circles. And you see this kind of stuff all the time in granite, and that's not anything remarkable. But what's remarkable is that somebody who wasn't even a creationist, by the way, happened to find these, it's called radio halos, those patterns, but radio halos that must have been made by polonium-218. And then the reason why that particular radioisotope is special is because the half-life is only 3 minutes. Things like uranium-238 would have like half-lives of like many years, thousands, millions, billions. So, but this one, half-life is only like 3 minutes. Now, why is that a big deal? And I want you to think about this. If the, by the way, yeah, that's how you would like determine what isotope it is based on the diameter and stuff like that. And the reason why that's special is because if the half-life is only 3 minutes, and if it left these marks in the granite rock, the bottom of the Earth's crust, right? If it was true that the whole Earth was like this liquidy molten magma-like mess for millions of, or possibly a billion years long, right? Any marking, any tissue, any marking that was left in that rock layer should have been melted away, and you shouldn't be able to see that today because it was liquidy. It was like supposedly melted glass. Does that make sense? So the fact that you can see those markings today must mean that however that bottom of the Earth's crust, the granite rock layer was formed, it probably had to be formed within like a few minutes, not millions or billions of years. Does that make sense? I don't know how long exactly it takes God to say, let there be, but that probably fits in the timeline. Does that make sense? So that's what this one paper that was published by actually an evolutionist, he later became a creationist as a result of the influence from his own work that had this implication. Sadly, he was sort of kicked out of scientific field because other geologists realized what the implications are, and can't have that. So. Another origin of life, origin of Earth type of stuff that I want to kind of talk to you about I have to give you a little bit of biology lesson, and I apologize. You probably have heard that like your genetic fingerprints all in these molecules called DNA, and they're like code books that code for like how to synthesize, how to make these protein molecules that do bulk of what you do, what happens to you, and what your body does as far as all the biology and physiology goes in your body. It's all done by proteins. And those proteins, you might have heard, that they're made from these individual smaller molecules called amino acids. Okay, so that's the bit that I want you to be aware of. And so you have to go grab that information from, you first have to unwind these twisted helical DNA molecule and then read the information, transcribe that onto another molecule, the exact same information, and then take that to a different part of the cell. And then that is this strand, mRNA, kind of made famous because of certain like vaccine lately. But and then that sort of summons all these bunch of other proteins that bring each individual amino acid so that you can make these big chains of protein molecules. Okay, and that process, even for like a really simple organism, at least takes 75 different enzymes. Or enzymes are made of proteins, by the way. It takes at least 75 enzymes, and that's the biology lesson I want you to know. Of course, the evolutionists, they wanted to have an explanation for how everything started that is apart from a creator. So one of the things that they had to first study was, well, like maybe based, all the lightning and harsh environment that the primordial, the beginning Earth might have had, maybe that environment would, because of heat and whatnot, combine all these chemicals that were there naturally and make things like amino acids, the building blocks of life. Okay. So they did this very famous experiment called Miller-Urey experiment. Indeed, they actually found some amino acids formed, but there's an issue with that I want to get to. But this particular experiment and what it's supposed to mean, it's kind of near and dear to my heart because it was done in this lab pictured there at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And the BBC wanted to do a documentary of that particular lab where that origin of life experiment was originally done. So they came and made a documentary. When they were shooting this footage, I'm in that room behind his ear. That's where I did my PhD, and that was my office. And also the guy that was a graduate PhD student with the guy Miller-Urey that did the original experiment. He's now old. He was young back then, but like he was in that documentary by BBC talking about the significance of that experiment. And then, sorry, this is kind of self-centered things to mention, but on the whiteboard there, you see my handwriting because I helped him with some of the experiments he was running, which I kind of got a kick out of because I was like, Jeff, his name is Jeff Bader. Jeff probably doesn't realize I'm a creationist. But anyway, he knew I was a Christian, though he just didn't know I was a creationist. But I tried to make nice because I needed to use his ammonia tank in that lab. I had to borrow it sometimes. But anyway, so what's missing from this experiment? So the experiment that was done, they would put these like sort of primordial gases in this setup, glassware setup, like methane, water, ammonia gas, and stuff like that. And then, people imagined that there was like lightning, thundering type of stuff going on. So they would have a high voltage setup inside. And then, the Earth supposedly was super hot, so there's a source of heat that boils all this simulated ocean water and whatnot, and then this whole thing circulates kind of like regular water cycle. And lo and behold, they did actually were able to make a few amino acids, but there's a really crucial thing missing from here that is really important. Can you tell like what's missing that's important from this simulated early Earth experiment? Something you really need and appreciate, and it's oxygen. Okay. And the reason why that's so important is because the oxygen or O2 that you breathe here is in equilibrium. It kind of goes back and forth with O3, which is ozone, that makes up the ozone layer that protects us from the harmful UV and whatnot. So the fact that those two things are in equilibrium means that if you take away oxygen, you would not have ozone. And if you don't have ozone, that means you don't have oxygen either. Does that make sense? So the problem is if in this simulation you say that, well, in the early Earth there was no oxygen because the plants haven't evolved yet. Fine. If there's no oxygen, then there is harmful UV ray that directly hits all these environments that would totally degrade unstable molecules like amino acids. So they could not have formed if there was UV ray present. Does that make sense? But then, if you're the evolutionist arguing with me, you might change your mind and say, well, let's just say there was oxygen. Well, fine then. Then oxygen would oxidize all the amino acids that would be formed. So still the same result. You could not form any of these compounds at all. They purposely took that out of the simulation because any chemist could tell you those things would not form if there was oxygen or if there was no oxygen in either scenario. And not to mention, there's the issue about these amino acids that we talked about. They come in, they're called chiral molecules. That means they kind of have a handedness to them. It's like your two hands, they are mirror images of each other, so they look the same. But especially if you're a left-handed person with, trying to buy a cheap baseball glove, the two hands are different, right? So same thing applies to these amino acids, and every amino acid that makes up these proteins, they have to be left-handed. So there's that issue there. The amino acids that they found in those Miller-Urey experiment setup, they were all mixture of left-handed and right-handed, and from that mixture you can't very well make functioning protein. And speaking of making proteins are kind of like this. You can imagine it looking like this. Each of the little beads that make up the jewelry being like each individual amino acid that are put together in a chain. And this calculation, I don't want to bore you with it too much, but maybe as a creationist, you're feeling generous if you're debating evolutionists. So you say, well, let's just say by miracle you made amino acids, a bunch of them in the beginning Earth. We'll give you that. Could you possibly, if you give it enough time, like 10 billion years, make like a functioning protein ever form if given enough time? Well, let's think about that. So the smallest protein that we know about has about 100 amino acids in it to make up the chain. And let's say that miraculously only the left-handed amino acids are available on the primordial Earth. That means for each of those 100 amino acid positions, there's 20 different amino acids. So like if you think about the probability of having just the right amino acids at those 100 positions, it would be the probability of like 1/20 raised to the, 100 raised to the power of 20 raised to the power of 100. What am I saying? So that's really astronomically small percentage, small probability. But let's just say that like you had so much amino acids at the beginning that maybe you could make that happen or something. Like as in if the entire Earth was surprisingly made of just amino acids, which is essentially the same thing as saying Earth is made of cheese, because cheese is actually all proteins mostly, and made of amino acids. So let's say the Earth was made of cheese, and it's all made of amino acids. But even then, if you calculate how many molecules of amino acids that would be if the entire planet was made of amino acids, you still could not make enough randomly synthesized proteins so that at least some of them or one of them could be that smallest, most simple protein we know about. By a factor of like 10 to the 50, you're off. And that's the type of number that I don't know how to pronounce, because that's way more than trillion or gazillion or anything like that. Does that make sense? So if you're a reasonable person, you would say that that could never happen. Doesn't matter how much time there is, right? Another thing that people consider is the idea that was popularized by people like Michael Behe, that he coined this term irreducible complexity. And to explain that, the example he uses is a really good one. And if you kind of have a weak stomach like I do, I'm sorry about the mouse picture right there. But so you guys know how the mouse trap works, but like it's fairly simple device, but it's made of several parts, right? That can be taken apart. And the thing about the mouse trap is the part that like you have to hook and like it's spring loaded. It's so delicate that if the design was slightly off, like it'll spring back up and probably hurt your finger, right? So all of that to say, it's a device that will not work if any of the 5 or 6 parts was slightly incomplete or slightly wrongly designed. Does that make sense? So all those things have to be there at the same time and totally complete for that whole system to work. And if any of those parts was sort of evolving on its way, then like this whole thing would not work. That's the idea of irreducible complexity. And then you see those things everywhere in biology, like even the simplest bacteria. If you take a look at how that cell is put together, when often they have to move a little bit, and when they do, they have these features called flagellum. If you study by the way, they're made of mostly from proteins, and then if you studied how that is put together, it's really amazing, because it works just like a motor that's attached to a transmission with a clutch that's connected to an axle. The makeup is exactly that sort of thing, and in fact, there's a sort of a molecular clutch system in it that controls how fast and how fast the flagellum should rotate and move around to give that mobility to the bacterial cell. So the animation here isn't working, but like this whole thing, it's, by the way, each of those little parts is made of each individual protein. And then these things rotate around just like the mechanical motor. And you can kind of see the equivalent parts in our modern day engine and car system, which very much screams of ingenuity there. But and so what do evolutionists do with this? They would say, well, that's pretty irreducibly complex, but there's other things in biology that like look and behave similar, so it must have evolved from those. Like in your, you probably have heard of this part of your cell called mitochondria that makes your energy and whatnot. One of the ways, well, the main way that it does that is it has this molecular pump and motor system that rotates when there's different concentrations of certain substances inside and outside. that difference in concentration is enough for those stuff to like try to go to the other side of the membrane. And as it does, it rotates this pump system that will bring together a couple of molecules and force them together to make a high energy molecule. And that's how you get energy to do anything at all. Okay. And it's a similar sort of motorized system that's put together similar looking proteins. So people would say, well, evolved from that. And sometimes people say, it's coming from this other system called type 3 secretion system. That's the like a feature that bacteria have to inject stuff into your cell so that it's easier for them to colonize your cell and make it their own. And so that's usually like toxins that tend to kill us and stuff. The mechanism is kind of similar to the thing that's on top of sriracha, twist it and open. If you know what I'm talking about, that's how it opens and injects stuff. So again, it has sort of similar like motorized transmission type system. So they say, well, it obviously evolved from these, but then if you think about it, right, they didn't solve any of the issues because even this simpler version is irreducibly complex. Like none of these protein parts would do anything helpful for the organism at all if they're not all there at the same time. In fact, if only some of those parts were present, they would die immediately because that means there's sort of a leakage from the inside of the cell to the outside, and any substance could go in and kill, burst open that cell. So to have parts of these developed through evolution would be totally not beneficial. It would be harmful to the cell. So these things couldn't exist by themselves. You could say the same thing about other biochemical reactions that happen in your own body, like even the phenomena that, like, if you get a cut on your finger, that eventually the bleeding eventually stops because of clotting, microscopic clotting and whatnot. That is a really remarkably complex system that involves each of those little things on that cartoon is a separate protein. This is the simplified version. So all of those things have to be 100% functional. In fact, some of the genetic diseases that some people have where, like, once you start bleeding, you can't stop, it won't stop, stuff like that. It's a defect with one of these proteins sometimes and whatnot, right? So if these things are kind of on their way to be evolved into the functioning state, you would not be alive. Okay, so these are irreducible complex systems. So much so that I mentioned that guy, my old role model back in the day, Richard Dawkins, who's famous for books like The God Delusion, was interviewed by Ben Stein in this documentary called No Intelligence Allowed. And in it, basically all this like features that can only be explained by sort of intelligent, what some people call intelligent design theory. Those stuff, that kind of topics were brought up in the conversation. And so at one point, I figured the video won't work, so I just put the transcript there. But Dawkins admits, he said when Ben Stein presses, so what do you think the possibility that intelligent design or something like that might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in Darwinian evolution? And then Dawkins basically says, well, it could come about in this way, that maybe super highly evolved alien civilization came and planted the original beginning of life, because once we have a working cell, then maybe that could evolve into other things. The only I shouldn't say the only, the biggest issue that sort of atheistic evolutionists have is to explain anything that make up that very first cell. It's just an utter impossibility. So to overcome that, people like him would say it was probably seeded by some intelligent civilization from elsewhere in the universe or something. But of course, if you think about it, right, that doesn't quite solve the issue either, because, well, how did they evolve, right? So Anyway, but that's how people cope with it. Um, what I once again try to talk about the giraffe stuff, but maybe I'll skip this just in the interest of time. Giraffes have a nice heart and a interesting brain system. But some of these issues became so big, like, especially like even thinking about things like, how did, evolutionists talk about birds being a descendant of essentially dinosaurs, that they came from reptiles. If you study the physiological difference between birds and reptiles, the difference is so astronomically large that, and a lot of the differences are sort of irreducibly complex, in that if some of those features partially got developed, it would be detrimental to the organism. Does that make sense? So you really couldn't even reasonably just imagine, let alone an physical evidence, imagine how that evolution, at least biochemically, could have happened. So that's a big obstacle. And so to overcome that, some people, evolutionists, came up with this idea that they coined punctuated equilibrium, which, this is a kind of a gross oversimplification, but it basically means that maybe the first bird that evolved hatched from a reptile's egg. Exactly, kind of like the cartoon here, because that's what it seems like happened from the fossil record. And unless something like that happened, it's really hard to explain how those changes would be possible. So they would say, for many years, sometimes evolution happens really slowly, which is kind of what Darwin said, which, in my mind, Darwin's evolutionism is way more reasonable than this punctuated equilibrium idea, because it would say, like, once in a while, like, there's such a huge amount of change that happens that, like, you could almost have a bird hatching from a reptile egg. And that's sort of what this idea is. And that's usually what they would say explains things like, we talked about this last time, but Cambrian explosion, like, there's one sedimentation layer that all of a sudden contains all the different big groups, kinds of animals, called different phyla of animals, all appear in one shot, in one layer. But maybe that's because of punctuated equilibrium. But just because you coined a nice term, you really didn't solve anything, because that's just physically, biochemically, pretty much impossible for it to happen. So I'm kind of delving a little bit into the territory of human evolution stuff, but next week I figured I have so much material to talk about. I won't have time to talk about stuff like this, so I put it in here. Here's an interesting professor from a leading university in UK. His name is James Allen. So for the first 40 years of his life, he was a staunch evolutionist, but he's a geneticist, by the way. He studies genetics. And in his career, he thinks about these things. And then when he thought about it, well, chimps and humans, we differ at least in 5,000 genes. Each gene is an instruction information for making one protein molecule. Okay, and so we differ at least in 5,000 genes. And let's say that, like, we somehow evolved from apes for this discussion, sort of hypothetical experiment. Okay, let's say that happened. For that to happen, typically we know this from genetics, even like because small changes within each kind of animals, creatures, that is something that definitely happens. Like last week we talked about, if you were to accept the creationist worldview, you have to understand that, like, especially after the flood, all these variations, even within the human race or different kinds of dogs or what have you, all those variations came from the common ancestor, right? So, like, there is a genetic and molecular biology mechanism for small variations to happen within the same kinds of creatures. Does that make sense? And when that happens, you need to typically have, the idea is called genetic death, but you need to have, compared to the number of individuals who were sort of blessed with that new beneficial mutation, you need to have about 30 times the number of individuals in the population that will have a genetic death, or they just die out without passing on their sort of inferior genes to the next generation, or that change or evolution cannot happen. Okay, so keep that in mind. And then if you assume the average mutation rate, which is, this one's very generous, more generous than like what's quoted in Wikipedia, but it's, you could assume it to be something like 10 to the negative 6. What that means is, on average, in a generation of individuals, whether it's humans or bacteria or bugs or plants, in one generation, like there's usually only 1 in a million genes that could experience some, like, or 1 in a million pieces of DNA that could experience mutation that sticks. So that's what that means. And then if you multiply all those together, you come up with a number that has to be there for us to have evolved from something like apes that differ in 5,000 genes or more. And that's 150 billion individuals all in the same place. And now, here's the, like, a human population growth curve. It was only like 1800s that we hit like 1 billion or so. And then you go back so many years, and on this graph anyway, it's, by the time you go back to Jesus' days, at least in this graph scale, it's almost zero population, because it was a much smaller population than we have today, right? So if the humans had to have evolved from something like apes, that is supposedly before Jesus' time, I think evolutionists would agree with that too. There could not have been 150 billion individuals all geographically in one place. I mean, there's like no one would argue for that. It's kind of a ridiculous notion. Just to wrap this up, this is kind of an interesting, speaking of mutation, and this is kind of a good segue into what we will talk about with the flood and what the world might have been like and stuff like that. Did you guys ever wonder, like, why, like, your dogs, eats disgusting things and whatnot and still never gets sick, and they seem to have like an iron steel like immune system, right? One of the reasons could be that most animals actually could make vitamin C on demand. And I don't mean just somewhere in the body, but at the particular place where infection might be beginning to happen, they can produce it on demand to fight against whatever they need to fight against. And there's only like a few handful of species among animals, me included, and by the way, so do you. And these species that I listed that cannot make vitamin C on demand, like guinea pigs. So we have to get it from dietary sources. And why is that a big deal? Because after we studied our own genome or genes, we found out that even though, from the ancient times, we knew we couldn't make our own vitamin C, but we found out by studying our own genes that we actually have the stinking gene that codes for the enzyme that could make vitamin C on demand, but it has a sort of a harmful mutation in it that makes it not work. If you're really curious, it's that circled part of the sequence that's probably the issue compared to the rat's equivalent enzyme, which, by the way, they can make it, we can't. Okay, so what does that tell us? That means that, like, well, that tells us actually a lot of things, but at some point, probably, because this is true across the board for all, and it doesn't matter what your ethnic background is, you have this defective gene. Okay, that means probably we share a fairly recent common ancestor. That's one. maybe like the flood and whatnot. But number two, a lot of the mutations that we experience usually, well, I shouldn't say usually, always are harmful, like the mutation we talked about. I won't maybe talk about the alcohol stuff. I'm one of those East Asian people that cannot digest or metabolize alcohol at all. So I can't even take NyQuil. So anyway, it's neither here nor there. But like, uh, ooh, I might have to skip this. We'll talk about this with the flood stuff. The way that if you look at Genesis 10 and whatnot, and then figure out like how many years people lived after the flood, the way that lifespan decreases is consistent with the way that it's called biological decay curve. But if that population is all of a sudden exposed to conditions that start introducing harmful mutations, and things just start degrading, go downhill from there, kind of a situation. If that happens, things should decay or get worse, just like what's called biological decay curve. And interestingly, the lifespan after Noah's generation exactly fits that decay curve, meaning we've been getting worse and worse ever since Noah, which means that here's one more reason why you should maybe honor your parents, because that means your parents are biologically superior to you, because they would have had less harmful mutations than you do. Does that make sense? Sorry, kids, you're biologically inferior to your parents. Oh man, I don't have time to talk about this, but swine flu strain interestingly accumulated so many harmful mutations that they went extinct 15 years ago. Anyway, all that to say, we only get harmful mutations. And the last thing I want to open it up to questions. So I wanted to, maybe I'll talk about this. I just love this stuff. There's a bacteria that grows on the surface of the rocks that's just chilling on the side of highway in Texas. It's a bacteria that nobody ever thinks about. I don't think you ever thought about the welfare of that said bacteria ever, but that bacteria produces this really complex looking molecule that is made like a really sophisticated molecular weapon, because this left-hand side of it recognizes the DNA sequence of rival bacteria. And then the right-hand side has this molecular mechanism that looks like has a triggering system. And then once it gets triggered, it changes its shape to attack that said DNA of the rival bacteria, so that this particular bacteria can have a surviving edge over other bacteria in the environment. That puts a really different spin on versus like this, I think. Sorry. The stuff Jesus talks about how God clothes the grass of the field. Because you might say, well, isn't that kind of a stretch to say God cared about that stupid bacteria in Texas so much that he equipped it with that weird molecule? I don't think that's a stretch, because Jesus says even about the grass. I'm not even talking about birds and whatnot, animals. It says God cared about the welfare of grass enough that he clothed the grass. So I don't think it's a stretch to say he thought about the welfare even of that stupid soil bacteria in Texas, which good thing we studied that. This became the origin of one of the well-prescribed cancer drugs that's used today. But anyway, so with that, right, and then that, of course, Jesus' message was, if God cares about these like silly little creatures so much to put that much thought into making this bacteria, so much, how much would he care about you? Yeah, I would really love to take questions and stuff. So, okay, oh, sweet, thank you. If anybody has... It could even be complaints or comments or anything. Questions. That's the fun part. Yeah.
So you're just basically saying that when an evolution cannot answer something, they come up with the most absurd, like a chicken came out of a. I mean, they don't.
Yeah.
So they come up with a definition, and they come up with a design. Like these aliens might have been here before us, but
Right.
where was the origin? So there's never. They just make up something basically to
Yeah.
fit their theory.
Right. But at least they're trying to explain what they're observing. So I'll give them that. But yeah, you're right. You're totally right about what you said. So, um,
Talk.
yeah.
I just wanted to mention this to you. I shared this with Penny the other day. If you pay attention to the church prayer list, you'll know that we've been asking prayer for my sister who was in critical care for like 19, 20 days and was life-flighted from Altoona Hospital to Shadyside, UPMC Shadyside in Pittsburgh. And Penny's quote to me the other day, we were walking together in the gym, is that the Lord has made us so beautifully made. My sister was sick unto death. She had 2 bacterias in her white blood cells that were killing her. And they called us to the hospital because they wanted as much of the family there that could be there. Sunday a week ago, because they thought we were losing her. They said she was sick unto death. But they shared, and I probably don't have this all right, but they shared, to Penny's point, about how beautifully made the Lord has made us, that when you're that ill, when you're that sick, your body actually steals blood cells, and protects your main organs, your brain, your heart, your lungs, your liver, and your body just does it. That's how the Lord has made us. And so my sister's feet are turning blue because her feet and toes have been robbed of blood, but the body is actually designed to keep itself alive to that extent. And she is much better today, and we think it's because of the power of prayer, because of the God who we serve. But I just thought, I mean, that has just impacted me so much, and I just thought I wanted to share that with you tonight.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. And praise the Lord for what he's doing there. Thank you. Giraffe. Okay. All right. We could talk about the giraffe. So this evolutionistic story is that like they used to be these. Where are the giraffes? Oh, here it is. There used to be these like short-necked animals that kind of wish they could reach those like high branches for more yummy new young leaves and whatnot. And then like some of them were born with slightly longer necks, just because of mutation and whatever. And those are the individuals that fared better than the shorter necked giraffes. And that change was very gradual or something like that. And then eventually like got longer and longer. And maybe so, but the issue is giraffes, they obviously have they're tall, right? And when they're standing upright, their head is really high off the ground. And to pump any liquid like up higher, it takes an enormous amount of pressure. In fact, as a kid, if you ever tried to like connect a bunch of straws like this long and try to suck up the liquid, it's really, really hard, even like at this distance or height, right? So you can imagine, sorry, the numbers written on there is really small. I don't know if you can read, but like between when they're standing upright and when they bend down, bend their head down to like drink water off the ground, the blood pressure difference is going to be so great that if there was no special mechanism to deal with this, every time they feel thirsty, they would have a brain aneurysm of really horrible magnitude, because all the blood vessels would burst. But so they would have to choose between, do I want to drink water or get that yummy tall young leaves up on the top of the leaf? But just so that they don't have to choose, the way that their body is sort of designed, the way their body is designed, or especially the cardiovascular system, is pretty remarkable. First of all, to get blood up to like that height, like really tall head, you need to have insane amount of blood pressure to begin with. So their heart is really, really large. That's apparently a real giraffe heart, which is really big. And but like I said, if they ever bend their head down, that's an issue. So they pretty much giraffes and like really similar species alone have this mechanism where they have not only like these vents that and gradually thicker like muscles in their arteries that like very minute control the blood pressure at a really in a small increment, starting at this height to the tall height. Not only that, but they have this really unique system that's like a sponge right before the carotid artery hits your brain. There's this like sponge system where the artery blood could divert to, just in case they bend their head down. And then that sponge web of artery system would absorb most of that blood pressure, so that their brain doesn't blow up every time they go take a drink. Now, that system is great for the modern, giraffe as it is. But if you were to have something like that for a short neck animal or creature like myself, then that's kind of like aneurysm waiting to happen and stuff like that. It's very detrimental to you if you don't have to have that spongy web of arteries right before your brain. And also there's like this switch off and diverting and switch off system. So like, when exactly did the giraffe have to think, oh, I better develop this web of arteries before my brain, and develop increasingly large heart? So all these things just is another example of an irreducible complexity, that if they're not the tall neck, the large heart, that web of shock absorbing system, they need to be there all at the same time, or it would kill you, is the idea. Okay, so that's just another more tangible example of irreducible complexity, is the giraffe story. But anyway, if that bring up any questions or anything like that? If not, I think we're done here. So maybe, I don't know, Matt or somebody could pray for us and close it up. But at this rate, are you guys going to send me a bunch of questions for the 6th week? Because without that, I'm just going to probably talk about whatever tiny weird topics that don't fit into those themes in the 6th week. And that's fine. But I'd rather talk about, things that everybody's interested in. Even if it's a weird topic, I don't mind talking about it. So anyway.
Okay. Do you guys want to pray with me? Okay. Heavenly Father, we're grateful, Lord, that we have this opportunity to come. And we're grateful for talk and his intelligence and his willingness to share, and just his heart for science and to explain some really complex things. Father, I just ask and pray that we can just use this information in conversation, that it helps reaffirm that what we believe in you and your Son, isn't foolish, but instead incredibly rational. And it just makes sense, Father. And we're thankful to be here. We're thankful to be alive. And so, Lord, just as we go out into the community and just to do life, Lord, that we remember how good you are. We thank you for that. In your name we pray. Amen.